Today I'd like to discuss a book called SLA Research and Language Teaching by Rod Ellis. As the title probably indicates, this is not a general interest book. This is something I read specifically because I was working as a language teacher. I was teaching English as a second language. This book was originally published in 1997. I'm actually not sure how current it actually is. Like when I read through it, everything in the book seemed more or less in line with what I had learned in my master's degree and what I had read in other books on SLA. But somebody might know more than me. I'm not up to date on the latest literature. So 1997 was a while ago now. If anyone has read this book and knows which parts of it are out of date, please chime in the comments. Rod Ellis, the author, is somebody who is an academic, and that's very evident in his writing. He writes more on the academic side, but he's very well known in the field of SLA, and both, I think, researchers and, in my experience, a lot of teachers generally know who he is as well. The book reads a little bit on the academic side, but it's readable. And if you've been in the field, you know that there are a lot of books that are published and articles that are published that are not readable, that are very difficult to wade through. Rod Ellis's prose is a little bit dense. I had to read it slowly, but it's perfectly understandable if you take it slowly. At least I thought so. The fact that he uses SLA in the title of the book instead of explaining what the acronym is, which is Second Language Acquisition. He just says SLA and he assumes you know what it is. That probably gives some indication of the intended audience for this book. So it's not an introductory book. I think I benefited greatly from reading this book by having some background in the field already and being familiar with some of the terminology and some of the theories. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone who wants to read more about second language acquisition to start with this book. And yet, like I said, it was pretty clearly written. Prose was a little bit dense, but everything was clear. So maybe you could read this book without a lot of background. Again, if you have read this book, let me know what your impressions are. How much background did you have when you went into it? How friendly do you think this book is to people who are new to the field? The book, in my opinion, starts off a little bit rough. The first 35 pages of this book weren't my favorite. So the first 35 pages of this book are discussing the relationship between the researchers who are doing the research into second language acquisition and the language teachers who are actually teaching it on a day-to-day basis. And Rod Ellis runs through several different theories, published theories, about what the relationship between a teacher and a researcher should be. I would have been okay with a much shorter version of this discussion. 10 or 15 pages would probably have been about my limit for how much we were discussing the relationship between researcher and teacher. By the time we ran through 35 pages, I was over it. I thought the discussion was running in circles a little bit, that a lot of it was just empty theories without a lot of concrete grounding. Now, granted, Rod Ellis is not making this up all himself. He's reviewing the literature. But at a certain point, I just stopped caring about what the literature says about the relationship between researchers and language teachers. Now, you can't really blame Rod Ellis for this. He is an academic and he is writing an academic book. And to a certain extent, if I tired of it, that is my failing. not his. But I do want to bring this up just to say that if anyone else picks up this book and they get a little sick of it in the first 35 pages and they're tempted to put it away, I would recommend sticking with it. There are a number of useful things in this book if you can get past the first 35 pages. So it looks like this book, it consists of several different chapters, and it looks like these chapters originally started life as separate articles, which were published in various research journals. And I think this is quite a common thing for academics to do, right? They published several different articles on a certain topic in various journals, and then they combine them all and they can sell it as one book. And fair enough. And, given how inaccessible those research journals are to anyone who's not employed by a university, maybe having a book like this on the shelves is a good way for the average teacher to get into the research. It is a little bit disjointed. Not all of these chapters fit together seamlessly, although they're all on the same general topic of SLA research, research into second language acquisition and language teaching. Some of the chapters go into quite detail, like going through one particular study. But the chapters that I found were the most interesting were the chapters which tended to take a step back and give a bird's eye view of what the research shows to date. I guess to date meaning to date in 1997, about how second languages are learned and what that means for language teaching. Now, there are a number of interesting things in here, but for the purposes of this discussion, because it's not possible to talk about everything, I'm just going to talk about a few of the things which I found interesting. And I guess one of those was a discussion about teaching grammar. Should it be taught? And how should it be taught? And according to what the research shows on second language learning or second language acquisition. So there is a school of thought most prominently associated with Stephen Krashen that language can be acquired by input only. Now, the research seems to show that's not completely true, although a lot of language can be acquired by input. But there are some more complex forms which are resistant to being taught only through the input. So Rod Ellis is advocating that we should be teaching grammar, but how to teach grammar is the question. And one of the questions that Rod Ellis is concerned with picking apart is the issue with the order of acquisition. So the order of acquisition is something that's come up in second language acquisition. Krashen, who I just mentioned, makes a big deal about this. There's a number of grammar points, and different syllabuses will order the grammar points in different ways. So some syllabuses will have you learn this grammar point before this grammar point. Some syllabuses will have you learn this grammar point before this grammar point, etc. You can order the grammar in the syllabus in any number of different ways. But the research has seemed to show that learners have their own internal syllabus. Regardless of the way the course is structured, learners will learn certain grammar points in a predictable order. And the research has roughly sketched out the order in which learners will learn these grammar points. And some of the grammar points are acquired very early on. And these will be things like the ing form on verbs, like run, running, eat, eating, swimming, studying, etc. That ing form is acquired very early on. But then there are other things that are acquired very late in the syllabus. And these would be things like the regular past tense, the ed endings, like looked, or stopped. The third person singular S, for example, I walk, you walk, he walks. And the possessive S. So this is Tom's pen, for example. All three of those are examples of things which would be late acquired, according to the order of acquisition. And the research would seem to indicate that you could put them earlier in the syllabus if you want to, but the learners aren't going to learn it until they've learned a number of other things, because for whatever reason, learners seem to learn the grammar points in a particular order, regardless of how they're structured in the syllabus. So as Rod Ellis notes, this has been one of the major findings of research into second language acquisition. But then, what to do with this in the classroom? So I guess the obvious question is, should the syllabus reflect what we know about the order of acquisition of the grammar points? Rod Ellis actually argues no on this for a couple of different reasons. One reason is the research into the order of acquisition is still developing. So we don't know what the order of acquisition is for all the grammar points yet. We know about it for some. We are relatively sure that there is an order of acquisition, but some of those parts are still moving around a little bit as new research comes in. But the other thing that Rod Ellis says, which is I'm sure every teacher will agree with, is that you'll never have a class where all the students are at the same point in their acquisition. So any teacher knows this, right? You're teaching a language class. You have 20 students who are all supposed to be at the pre-intermediate level. But in reality, there's a couple students who are very low on that scale. Maybe a couple of students who shouldn't be in that class, but the school put them in anyways. You've got a few students who are very high in that class, who are maybe just on the verge of testing out, etc. Every teacher knows what I'm talking about. The students in a language class are all at different levels. So if you're trying to teach to the class, which students do you go for in terms of the order of acquisition? And then the other thing about the order of acquisition is it's very difficult for the teacher to know exactly where the students are, because these forms would emerge gradually. So, for all those reasons, it makes it very difficult to design a syllabus around the order of acquisition. So what to do instead? Well, Rod Ellis makes an interesting point, which I actually had never thought of before reading this book, which is that the order of acquisition is only for the ability to use the language in CELTA terms, what is known as free production. So you're having a conversation completely unaided, and you're able to use these grammar points naturally. That's what the order of acquisition refers to. The order of acquisition does not refer to the ability to understand the grammar points. So even the grammar points which are very low on the order of acquisition list, like the third person singular S, or like the regular past verb forms, they can be taught to low-level learners receptively. You can teach them to recognize it, you can teach them what it is, you can teach them how to understand it. Now they won't be able to produce it yet, but you can still be able to understand, you can still teach them how to understand it. So, for example, Rod Ellis recommends doing grammar exercises where the students are given sentences using the grammar points, and they have to match the sentences to the pictures. So you're only testing them receptively on it. You're not asking them to produce. He also indicates that there's certain types of controlled practice which are not affected by the order of acquisition. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the third person singular S. This seems to be very late acquired in terms of natural conversation. So if a student is just talking naturally, it's going to be a long time before he's able to use the third person singular S naturally. But if he's doing fill in the gap exercises with a paper and pencil, like I walk, you walk, he walks, where all the student has to do is write in the word and distinguish whether it has an S or not, that's not associated by the order of acquisition. So the student can do that. Now, this, to my mind, makes you think a lot about what the brain is actually doing during these different exercises and what makes it different. It's a question Rod Ellis doesn't really get into, and I believe the exact nature of the cognitive processes that are involved in second language acquisition and language learning like this is much a matter of conjecture. We don't actually know how the brain is working well enough to answer these questions. We can only make guesses. One guess is that the order of acquisition is functioning because the human attention is limited. So, for example, the brain can only focus on a limited number of things at any given time. Say, I don't know, maybe one thing at any given time. When you're speaking a language, your brain is having to do all sorts of things. It's having to think of what the message is you want to say. It's having to select the words that go with the thing you want to say. It's having to send messages to your mouth and your tongue for how to articulate what you want to say. And it's also having to attend to the grammar. Where do the words go in the sentences? How do the morphology of the nouns and the verbs inflect to give the correct grammar to what you want to say, etc. So, I mean, it really is quite an amazing thing, human language, isn't it? When you're communicating in real time. Perhaps because the human attention is only limited to one thing, you can only attend to one grammatical detail at a time unless the other details are automatic. Unless you're not thinking about them, they're just in your subconscious. They have been automated. And then as stuff gets automated in a particular order, it gives your brain more attention to focus on stuff that's lower down the order of acquisition. I should know that all of what I just said is my own conjecture, or not completely my own conjecture, but my own musings informed by some of the stuff I've read. Rod Ellis actually does not agree with this position. He calls it the strong interface position, where you learn something, you practice it, and then it becomes automatic and then becomes part of your implicit knowledge. And he doesn't agree with equating implicit knowledge. Implicit knowledge means kind of something in your subconscious with automated processes. But he does agree with what he calls the weak interface position. So the weak interface position is you will learn a grammar point, initially maybe only for comprehension. You'll just learn it receptively and with some controlled practice exercises. And then because you know it, you may start recognizing it more in the input. So, for example, if a student is taught the third person singular S, they're not ready to use it in free conversation yet, but because they've been taught it in the classroom, when they are reading or listening to English and they're getting that input, they begin to notice it a little bit. They're like, oh, hey, I studied that before. That's that third person singular S my teacher was telling me about. And because they're paying attention to it, then the forms will register in the brain more, and then maybe because the forms are registering in the brain, that will cause the language to become implicit, or that will cause the language acquisition device in the human brain to start acquiring those forms. I think that's what Rod Ellis is saying, at any rate. Now, if you've been through a CELTA program, you may notice that this theory of language learning is different than what's taught in a CELTA. So on a CELTA, you're presented with a number of different lesson frameworks, but I guess the one most typically associated with the CELTA is the PPP, the present, practice, and produce. So students are first presented with a language point, and then they practice it with controlled practice or semi-controlled practice. And then they get to the produce, the free production, where they're expected to have a conversation using that grammar point, for example. So if we follow what Rod Ellis is saying here, and what Rod Ellis says the research is saying, that means that if the students are not ready to acquire that grammar point, they will not be able to use it in free production by the end of the 90 minutes, or however long that lesson is. As I was reading this, I was thinking, oh, okay, this is turning over on its head everything I learned on the CELTA. I thought I had to get these students to use this grammar point at the end of the grammar lesson in a free production setting, but maybe that's not possible. Now, to be fair, there are different interpretations, in my experience, of the final stage of the PPP lesson, that production stage. And this is just my anecdotal experience based on talking to different teacher trainers and talking to people in the staff room. But I've known some people who believe that the free production stage is just a stage where the students can use that grammar point. You're setting up some sort of communicative task where the grammar point could easily be used in this task, but the students are not obliged to use it. They can use whatever resources they have. But I've also known teachers and teacher trainers who believe that it's the teacher's job to insist that the students use that grammar point in that free production at the end. And I guess that it's that latter view which would be problematic for Rod Ellis's view that they just might not be ready for it yet. And Rod Ellis does cite data. So he gives some data from a few different studies, one on the order of adjectives, I think one on some students in Japan. And he shows that they are actually not able to move from the controlled practice to the free production within the course of the lesson. The free production, the acquiring the language, happens on its own timetable. You can't force them into learning it at the end of the grammar lesson if you're following the CELTA framework. Now, it might be interesting to hear from the other language teachers in the comments what your experience with this has been. Since reading this book by Rod Ellis, I admit myself to have been largely a convert to this view. Maybe I got converted a little bit too easily, I don't know, but for years afterwards, I was going around saying, you can't expect the students to do the grammar point in the free production if they're not ready to acquire it yet. So you can set up the production stage of the grammar lesson, but the students may not be ready to use it. I've got some pushback on that. There was a CELTA tutor that I worked with a few years ago who was somebody I really respected and somebody who seemed to know his stuff, who was not willing to accept that. Said, no, they can do it. I've seen them do it many different times. So he really felt strongly that in his lessons and some of the lessons that he guided, in successful lessons, the students were guided to be able to do complex grammar points, which in some cases were even above their level but with the right scaffolding, they could get to the free production by the end of that 90-minute lesson. I don't know. Let me know what your experience has been with that. It does raise the interesting question, though, Rod Ellis's view. How do we get students to the point where they're able to use the grammar in free production? So Rod Ellis does not argue that the students should only do controlled practice grammar exercises. We all know where that leads, right? I worked for several years in Japan, initially teaching in the public schools and the JEP program and other similar programs. And everybody who's worked in Japan knows that the students just only do controlled practice exercises and they never acquire the ability to use English in a communicative sense. And indeed, Rod Ellis cites this in his book, the example of the Japanese schools, how controlled practice does not lead to communicative fluency. So then, how do students get to the point where they're able to use the grammar if in the lesson our only expectation is that they'll be able to use it, they'll only be able to process it receptively and use it in controlled practice? I mean, Rod Ellis wants the students to have as much time to speak in class as they can and to communicate, to have a communicative classroom, so that the students are able to start acquiring whatever grammar points they're ready to acquire. And I guess the teacher's job is to teach them receptively and with controlled practice, but then the language will emerge on its own timetable in the student's communication. The problem with this, though, is he also cites studies which indicate that students often have trouble acquiring language from each other. So if you're in a foreign country and you have a group of students who all have the same native language, so for example, in my case in Vietnam, when all the students spoke Vietnamese, and their primary English communication is with each other. Rod Ellis cites a study where they would acquire only kind of a terminal pidgin type English for a number of different reasons. They will lose motivation to talk completely like a native speaker once they reach a functional stage. They're often not getting the necessary input that they will get because all their communication is with each other and they're picking up a lot of the same language mistakes from each other. There's a lot of L1 interference in their interlanguage, which they're all picking up from each other. Something which is very true in my context, and I suspect in a number of other teachers, is quite often the temptation for them to revert to their L1 into their native language, even when they're supposed to be practicing their English, is very strong. This is particularly true at the secondary levels, right? Where you're with a group of students who might not want to be in that class, but are there because the curriculum or their parents are making them. So the motivation to speaking in English is low, etc. Anyways, point being, if this is a problem, if they're not developing much more of a terminal pidgin by speaking with each other when they're trying to practice their English, how do we get them to communicate in English fluently? And this is a question I thought was not answered in Rod Ellis's book. Now, to be fair, I guess this book was not meant to be completely comprehensive and everything you need to know before you get into the language classroom. But it was a question that was left with me. Okay, I know that the students have a certain order of acquisition. I know that it's unrealistic for the syllabus to follow the order of acquisition. I know that because the students have a certain order of acquisition, that sometimes the most I can expect is that they will process the grammar point receptively and maybe in controlled practice, but won't be able to use it in free production. So how do we jump that last hurdle? There is a lot more stuff to talk about in this book, actually, but I'm out of time. So I'm going to have to stop things here. By all means, if you read this book, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Thank you.